What's the T stand for in T. Paul Jacobs?
Thomas. Thomas. My dad's name was Thomas Jacobs, and they didn't want me to end up being called Junior, and so they called me Paul. I have his first name, but they called me Paul. And obviously, with Thomas Paul, as Paul said to me once, he said, "You're from a good Christian family, I suspect."
When did you join Klipsch?
1991. 1991. I remember my first day. My official day was December 1st, but my actual work day was Black Friday of 1991. I was at Classic Stereo in South Bend, Indiana, with my first boss, Mike Dyer.
How did you get into audio? What in the business of audio?
Well, first being an audio fan and a music fan, and ultimately a musician, that I did some touring and played and recorded and did things like that. Out of school, I had tried other things, and the truth of the matter is, I don't know that I've ever shared this before, but how I got into it is I got into retail. And I got into retail because I'm an introvert. And I didn't like being an introvert, and I thought, if I start selling audio in a retail store, I'm going to be forced to talk to people all the time, and that may help me not be an introvert. And that's how I ended up at Federal Appliance, which then led me to being in the business side of audio. I wanted to stop being an introvert.
And I think you've shared that same sort of interest in why you became a musician, is trying to get over being an introvert.
Yeah, I found that, well, first I liked the girls a lot, and that was one of my driving forces. I think I've mentioned that before too. Being an introvert, it was hard for me to meet girls, and it just was the craziest thing when I put that bass on. They wanted to meet me, and I didn't have to work that hard at it. But I also found, and I think you hear a lot of actors will talk about it, and musicians they're introverts by nature, but when they put that instrument on, in my case, it became this powerful shield. And it allowed you to be something that you couldn't without. And that was a driving force for me.
And what was Lion and Associates? That was a firm that you were with for a period of time?
Yeah, so I had been in the retail side of the business, and I wanted to get into the manufacturing and wholesale side. And Bill Lyons, who happened to actually live in the same neighborhood with Fred Klipsch, who I met later on, Bill was a dynamic ex-Marine that ran a rep firm in 5 states, and he took a look at me and he said, "You're going to run this industry one day. I think you need to come to work for me." And I was still pretty introverted, but I recognized a guy that could help shape me, and he was my first real mentor.
You said ex-Marine. That ex-Marine runs through your life. Your dad was in the Marines?
My dad was a hardcore Marine, and as I've said many times, his discipline was incredible to me. My dad was up at 5 a.m. every morning. He had an aggressive workout regime. In my lifetime, I never saw him miss it, including the day before he passed away of stage 4 lung cancer. He was still at 5 a.m. downstairs for stage 4 lung cancer doing his Marine regime. He believed that when you had discipline like that, it made you a better person.
Now, did you have any dealings with Klipsch, either when you were at Freder or at Lion and Associates? Was Klipsch, did you sell those products, or?
I didn't sell them, but you run in those circles. So we had products where a lot of retailers that I sold in those days had the brand. And of course, I had known the brand because I had my first products at 13, so I was familiar with the brand and held it in high esteem. And that's the way the brand was always perceived in the market and the people that I called on, is it was one of those rare brands that people just, when they touched it, they seemed to look at the world differently. And so I did get to see it through that lens.
How did you end up landing at Klipsch in 1991?
Fred Klipsch, and I won't go through the whole story, it's kind of a separate story on its own, but Fred was Paul's second cousin, and eventually Paul had decided to sell to him in 1989. And Fred's a businessman from Indianapolis, and had his corporate headquarters there. And most functions were still in Hope, but Fred was there. The chief financial officer, Fred Farr, was there, and he brought a vice president of sales in that was there. And I was one of the first other employees that we shared. It was a 1,600 square foot space, and at one point I shared a conference table and a pencil and a phone with 3 other people. And so I ended up there because Fred wanted to change what was happening, and he and Paul had talked about this before they bought the company, is that Paul was concerned about the long-term health of the company. And one of the challenges that Fred saw that the company faced was their limited customer policy really constrained how much business they could do. In some cases, they had 1 dealer per state. And I remember my first year I started, the guys told me that, after November you don't call on the retailers. They're all finished and they're busy. Well, those were practices that I knew were not practices that were going on anywhere else. And what that made me believe is that we were not getting our fair share of business. So Fred were looking for some people that he could add to the mix, where he left intact the people that had the passion, the knowledge, and the history. But if you could bring some people in that could sort of help drag them along into a lot of that's really good, but the business keeps changing, and we have to be flexible enough to change with it, because ultimately we can be left behind if we don't change some of our practices. And I seemed to be a good fit at the time for what he was wanting, and when the opportunity came, I walked through the door and I've never looked back.
So you brought up an interesting point. I've always felt that at the early part of the company of Klipsch, that there was a time in audio when the market was product driven. You developed a product, something as revolutionary as the Klipsch horn, and people will eventually hear it and they'll buy it. And then my perspective is that at some point it became market driven. You had to develop products that the market wanted. I thought that may have happened later on, but it sounds like at the time you joined the company in 1991, it was already much more of a market-driven marketplace for audios. How would you comment on that?
I think that one of the reasons that Paul sold the company to Fred is, I'm now, Paul Klipsch has never said these words, so when I say this, it's just my observations. Because Paul is a really astute business guy. And I think that what happens to anyone that is a founder of a company is you sort of see when your vision, not of what the product should be, but how do I get this to market? How do we continue to sell? And how do we keep adjusting to something that's out of our control? Because market conditions are out of your control. I think that Paul felt that Fred would be a good steward of the brand, because Fred was a Klipsch through and through, and he respected Paul. But also that Fred brought a business acumen that was significantly greater than Klipsch the company had been exposed to before. Because I would say that when I went to work for the company in 91, they were already well behind the curve of how products were in distribution. And we at the time were still considered this super cool, niche-y little company that would, every retailer would sell some of, and they were fun and cool, but they're not going to be pushed hard to do too much, because Klipsch is, just very limited in what they want to do. And I think that if you're a good business guy the way Paul was, you want to make sure that your company is going to survive in the right way. And again, it's not just about staying true to the products, but do we have the distribution? Do we have the expertise to market in the new ways? Have we picked the right people that can sell the products and tell the story? And I think that we were behind the curve, which created a lot of the opportunity that Fred, by coming in and putting a few different people in place and creating a bit more of a broad vision of this kind of incredible brand that's almost the greatest secret in the world. We didn't have to blow the world up with it, but just by expanding in a consistent way, we could introduce a lot more people to Klipsch. And you also saw some evolution of products, some of the first bookshelf products and things that came out, they were definitely market-driven products, for sure.
Last question in this first area is, can you briefly take us through your evolution of what positions you held until ultimately the president and CEO? What was your position when you came on in 1991, and how did you progress?
I was hired as a sales rep. I had Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana. I think I had Kentucky, Tennessee. I had just some Midwestern states kind of right where I lived. And about 6 months later, I started growing the business. I just started doing things I would have normally done when I worked for Lyons and Associates, things that I thought made sense. In fact, Bill Lyons, I will never forget that one of the phrases that I learned from Bill early on, I used a lot at Klipsch, and it was, he told me, "It's interesting, but we make this business so complicated. But what you should do is ask every business owner, what do we need to do more business?" He said, for some reason, sales guys don't ask them that simple question, but if you do, they'll tell you. And so I just drove around, because we were car reps. I drove around to every customer we already had, and I asked every single one of them that question. I mean, a lot of them, we did it. We started to grow the business. And so 6 months later-ish, I was offered a regional manager slot, and I was smart enough to take that. And a couple of years later, Fred went through a big shakeup in the organization, and I had been traveling at that time. I think I had the 24 states west of the Mississippi, and I was on the road a lot. And they called me in on a Saturday morning, and they offered me the vice president of sales and marketing job. They had decided to let my boss go. And I took the job, and I was VP of sales and marketing for a period of time. And it was at that point in time that there were also some other changes at Klipsch. And in the CES of, it was either 95 or 96, I sat down with Fred and I asked him to consider letting me take over engineering and product design as well. Not because I was a product designer, although I had a pretty strong feeling about what the market needed, but I believe one of the conflicts that existed in the company at the time was that it had definitely become an us or them mentality. We had a lot of management was out of Indianapolis, and certainly sales and marketing was now being ran out of Indianapolis. Engineering and product design was being ran out of Hope. And my boss, before he left the company, and the gentleman that ran manufacturing and engineering, they had not a good relationship. Both gentlemen ended up leaving, and so what I told Fred is I said, give me a shot at seeing if we can get these two groups to meld more and work together. It's in the interest of the engineering design group to be working closely with sales, and sales, vice versa. And so I then, in that period of time, I also took on engineering and product design. At some point in time, and I don't remember the dates, I was promoted to executive vice president, and then executive vice president, chief operating officer, then president and chief operating officer, and then in June of 2011, Fred then did his final stint and left the company, and I became president and chief executive officer.
So let's talk a little bit about your meeting Paul Klipsch. We heard a very impassioned, sincere story yesterday. You mentioned about being 13 years old and listening to his speakers. What was it like to finally meet this man who designed what really opened your eyes to music and audio?
Well, I probably should put a little perspective around meeting Paul and even the entirety of my relationship with him is that I was certainly not a high-level person at Klipsch when I met Paul. I was brand new I was as junior as they get as a sales rep at Klipsch. And so I was relatively intimidated by the whole scene when I showed up in Hope, Arkansas, because you're coming to Mecca, and I'm going to meet the man. And of course, it was always a big debate in the Klipsch organization that you may or may not be aware, but they called engineering, they call it being on the hill. And that created a divide amongst the Hope employees because they felt like the engineers saw themselves as superior because they were on the hill. So here's this young guy that shows up, been following Paul since I was 13 years old, And suddenly the day comes, you're here, and now I'm being taken up the hill. I'm going to the hill to meet the man. And I just, mostly I didn't, I just didn't want to screw up. I didn't want to do anything that made me look stupid. I was very nervous about this whole thing. But when you met Paul, that's not how it was. At first, he didn't, whether I was a sales rep or I was, the King of England or something, that's just not the way he was. He didn't care. You were just a young guy and, let's talk audio. And that was almost always the way it was when I was with Paul. Certainly he was older when I met him in the early 90s. But the stories were always fascinating. To go into his office and sit down and hang out and talk with him and ask questions about stuff. He was always great about answering your questions, but he would ask as many questions as you would ever ask him. And he was always, I remember that it was always interesting because he'd always, first when he got your name, as I mentioned earlier, Thomas Paul. So you're from a good Christian family. And, he might tell you his story about the Presbyterians and, all the Episcopalians and all the other, his stories about religion and philosophy and things, which was always interesting. And he would talk about marketing, he would talk about products, but it was always just a really good give and take. But it was always it was always very centric around audio and the business. And as I was saying yesterday, one of the things that was always really consistent with Paul is he always carried his latest ideas about speaker design and evolution with him. They were always with him. And most of the time they were in his little leather folio that he kept in his pocket. And he always liked to talk about those things. But he would ask questions about your family. Brothers, sisters, mom and dad, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? And that was kind of what my relationship with him was. As I was around more and we became more comfortable, and as I talked yesterday, then he would end up at his house on a regular basis. And when I became vice president of sales, then the other thing that happened was that Valerie was the guardian of Paul. She guarded his time, she guarded his reputation, she guarded his physical health, she guarded his diet. She very much guarded Paul. And I think I may have told you yesterday, but there was occasion when I would not have a lot of time and I would try and sneak in and out of Hope, kind of unseen. And Valerie had eyes and ears everywhere. It was impossible to come to Hope, Arkansas, and Valerie not know. And she knew that I've always believed anyway that Paul liked to spend time with me when he could, because Valerie would certainly search me out and make sure I was coming to the house and eat dinner and talk speakers. But it was always about talking about speakers. For me, what was fascinating was it go way beyond audio for me, because when you looked at Paul's age and when he was born and the things that he had seen since he was a boy, just in life in general, and how technology had changed things and what had happened with cars, the fact that he was in the military, the fact that he had lived in Chile building electric railroads, to me that was stuff that was incredibly fascinating that I used to like to ask him about and talk about. That part of his life, and he was pretty good at it. He liked talking about those things, but it always circled back around audio. And as I was saying yesterday, that live your passion thing with Paul, it was hard to get him off of the audio, because you think about the stories he could tell about audio, they were amazing. But for me as a young guy, it was just as fascinating about what he did in ballistics and things when he was in the military, but even more fascinating that he went down to Chile to build electric railroads. I'd never met anybody that had gone on an adventure like that. And to me, at that point, it was like he was in the wilds of Africa or something. I know, you're in Chile building electric railroads. How amazing is that? So that was the relationship that I had with him, and Valerie was a big part of it as well. His wife was also a very big part. As I said, she was the guardian of the Paul Klipsch, life.
In previous interviews, you've mentioned you termed Paul as a teacher, an excellent teacher. Roy Delgado has talked about at times how Paul taught him speaker design and that he was an excellent teacher. What can you tell us about that, Paul as a teacher?
Well, the relationship that someone like Roy would have had or had with Paul was quite a bit different than mine in that I'm not an engineer. And so my takeaway from Paul was going to be from an entirely different perspective. And if you start with the fact that today they would say that Paul, the Klipsch was a startup, and that Paul bootstrapped it together, and he did all those things. He was an entrepreneur, he was an inventor, but he had this vision about what he wanted to create, and he was going to do it his way. Well, I didn't have to be an engineer to want to know everything about that. When did you decide you were going to take the risk? When did you decide you were going to not work in a corporation and have a guaranteed income? That you were just going to start this business? By the way, in 1946, which was not that long since we'd had some fairly tough economic times in this country, and yet because that was his passion and that was his vision. Again, that wasn't about speaker design. That was about this is how a visionary business guy takes this burning desire, and how do you turn that into a business? Where do you get the money? How do you manage it? And so I would ask him a lot of questions about that. As I said yesterday, some of the things that I learned from him had to do with how he lived his life, and I observed that very clearly. And a lot of the questions that I would ask him about, because if you read the stories of Paul, you could see he lived his life his way, and there were always interesting things, such as the fact the bullshit button. That was most of us wouldn't have the courage to walk around with a button to tell some idiot that's rambling on whether he was right or not, but Paul did. He had the courage to live his convictions. So courage is live your passion, live the way you believe, don't compromise, have the courage to stand up for it. It's not enough just to say, well, I won't compromise. You have to stand up for it sometimes, and sometimes in the face of what most other people might believe. But if it's your conviction and it's your core values, you should stand up. Paul is a perfect example of those things. And then the integrity part of it. That was always a really big one. And that was one that you would talk to Paul about because, he would talk about the heresy as an example. And it was always one of those interesting ones where, did you compromise when you built the heresy? If you compromise it, does that somehow infringe on your integrity? They should talk through it. Neither of those were the case. It was not. It was a compromise only, and that's why he called it a heresy. He had a little bit of feeling like he compromised, and so we'll just call it a heresy. It's not fully horn-loaded. Was that an integrity issue? Absolutely not. So it was always interesting, and that's really what I learned from him, was about how you can bootstrap your vision without a lot of cash. But you got to have a burning desire. You have to have an unbelievable work ethic, and you have to wake up every single morning and believe you're going to win. And then on the personal side, don't compromise. Live your passion, live your dreams, have the courage to stand up for it, and never give your integrity away. So when I walked away from that as a young 30-something, those were pretty powerful messages that I have tried to incorporate into my life.
So you were talking about the heresy earlier, and you've shared the story in the past about Paul telling you about he screwed a handle to the side of the heresy and lugged that around in his airplane. Coming from a sales background, what did you think when you heard he loaded these things up with a handle, and that's how he originally was selling these speakers? What did that make you think?
Well, I think that for me, it was this incredible cachet of how someone like Paul Klipsch was such a contributor to not only building a brand, but building an industry. Because if a lot of people are not aware why he did that and why he built the heresy in the first place, but when Paul started the business, this was long before stereo, and so the customers he had corner horns sitting around. They were singles, and when the concept of stereo started to come on the scene, somebody had to let them know what it was. So Paul had two 10-watt Brook amplifiers with kind of a door handle on those, and he built the heresy. And he built them so he could put them in his plane, and he could go see his customers, and he could explain what this stereo thing is going to be. When I think about that, it's extraordinary. This stereo thing. Paul was out there pioneering what stereo was going to be, which turned into the high-end 2-channel business. I thought it was brilliant. He didn't say, A lot of people may have said, I don't know what to do because the Klipsch horn is so big. How do I take a second one out? Paul did not worry about that a bit. He said, I'll bend a little bit for a good reason, and I'm going to show people what this amazing new technology is going to do. Always an innovator.
When you told us about the things you learned in discussions and that you came away with 4 core principal values, and you incorporate that and have and remind your employees and your team of that. How do you do? What are the 4 core principles, and how is it that you remind your team of those?
Well, these were the fundamentals that Paul believed in his 4 key design principles, which were wide dynamic range, controlled polar response, high efficiency, and flat frequency response. All Klipsch speaker design that Paul is involved with followed those. We feel it's essential that we always do the same. And so in our engineering level of our facility in Indianapolis, we had an artist come in and they took those concepts and created a full wall design where every one of those concepts are highlighted. So when our engineers walk in every day, we call it Touchdown Jesus, much like with Notre Dame football. They have to walk by Paul's 4 design principles. They turn right and they walk through across in front of a wall that's a collage of some of the great things that Paul was recognized for. It shows his awards into the Engineering and Science Hall of Fame. It shows him wearing 3 watches. It shows the original corner horn. They have to walk by that. Then they walk through the next door and there's a wall of all of Paul's patents. We think that's a pretty good way to remind them that, as I said yesterday, they're standing on the shoulders of a giant. Don't take it for granted. Don't compromise those principles. And just remember that when you're building those products. And that's how we do it, and that's how we live it. And I think that you found when you talk to any employee in our organization, it's sort of ingrained. It's not something that we push people on. They just feel it, and they understand it, and they live it.
What's your favorite Paul Klipsch story?
Well, as I was saying yesterday, I had to be real honest with myself because after telling PWK stories for 26 years, I had sort of lost track of which ones actually happened to me and which ones did I wish they had because I'd heard them so much I'd incorporated them into my life. So the story there's a couple I would say that always just stood out for me that I knew for sure happened to me. And one of them happened more than once, but it was a typical night at Paul's. And I loved it so much because I knew what was going to happen. And it was just the way Paul lived his life. When you went to Paul's house, you'd walk in and there was that little train that was a model of what he built down in Chile. And it had a little door that started in the house and it would go out by the pool so his wife could put a cocktail and send it out to Paul while he was sitting around the pool. I always thought that was, even as an older guy, I'm like, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. And then next to that are a pair of Klipsch horns with a bell Klipsch center. And so Paul could tell you about the story of him taking this stuff to the World's Fair and the recordings of the Singers on the Flying Trapeze and all these stories, these legendary stories you had heard. You're seeing this in the house, and you know the 2 grand pianos are sitting there, and Valerie might jump up and play piano. It was a surreal environment that you walked into, but then you knew what was going to happen. Paul always liked to drink Bushmilk, and you sort of, after you did it several times, you're hoping it's not going to be a long Bushmilk night because Paul was. Paul had that good German background of being able to drink and hold alcohol well, and sometimes, better than me. It didn't bother him, but he'd bring out the bottle of Bushmilk, and then he would bring out some of his famous Belgian beers, and Valerie would come out and say, "You boys talk about speaker design," and Paul would bring out his speaker design and start talking about things. And many times that were so far over my head, I just sat in awe because I wasn't sure what he was even saying because the technology that he talked about was beyond me. But I loved it. I was sucking every second of it up. And Valerie would go whip up an 8-course Austrian meal. She'd say it was a snack, and it would be an 8-course meal. And then ultimately, Paul would get around to, he'd flip his cabinet open. There would be his turntable and his reel-to-reel. And he'd say, "Young man, have I ever told you about the Bell Laboratories 1935 Symposium of Auditory Perspective?" and you didn't really get to answer the question. It was a rhetorical question. He knew you'd heard about it because he knew that he had shared it with you before. But then he was going to put it on, and you were going to listen to the Bell Laboratories 1935 Symposium of Auditory Perspective. And as a young guy doing that, you always knew when you were sitting there, this is pretty cool stuff that's happening, because this is him sharing the personal side of himself and the stuff that matters to him. And I'm sitting here with him doing things that there's a million people around the world that love to be sitting right where I'm at right now. I'm with the great Paul W. Klipsch. He's talking about speaker design with me. We're listening to the Bell Labs stuff that he loves so much. We're drinking his favorite whiskey. There's his train that he built. And I'm this young kid from, Indianapolis that heard his speakers at 13. This is surreal. To me, it would be like getting an opportunity to sit with Warren Buffett or just sit with Steve Jobs or something. And I get to do it many times. And it was like you were part of the family. That's how Paul treated you. Now, as far as my favorite story, one that I will never forget that was pure Paul, as we were at CES one year, and I was fairly new with the company, and we were out to dinner with our very largest customer. And they were generally a pretty arrogant bunch, and you could see immediately that these were not necessarily the kind of folks that Paul liked to hang out with a lot. Paul did not hide disdain when he didn't care for people. And there was one particular guy that was a pretty mouthy guy, and he was very confident in himself, and you could just see every time he opened his mouth, it was literally like somebody's fingernails on a chalkboard. Paul just had this grimace on his face like, I just want to punch this guy out. And eventually, after this guy quits touting all of his greatness, you got Paul Klipsch sitting at the end of the table, and this guy's taking up all the air by talking about all of his great feats. So pretty much everybody's fed up with this guy. He looks at Paul in just kind of this loud voice, not very respectful. He goes, Mr. Klipsch, I got a question for you. Doesn't really give Paul a chance to say, what is it? He said, why is it you wear 3 watches? And it was with a bit of an attitude, like, what possibly could you do? And I think everyone at the table knew that this guy had stepped on a duck, because everyone sort of sat back and the table goes silent. And it's like this light is shining down on this loud mouth. And Paul did an expression, and if you ever spent time with Paul, you saw him do it. He reached down and he grabs his face. And he does one of these, and he looks at the guy, and I'm like, oh, this doesn't look good. And at this point, this guy has gone pale, because he realized he's not exactly sure what he's done, but he's pretty sure that he's just offended one of the great men in our industry. But Paul handled it like Paul would handle it. So he sets this thing up with the long, pregnant pause. And he finally looks at him and he said, well, young man, because I like to know what time it is. And that is absolutely one of my favorite stories, because this guy didn't speak another word the entire night. He knew that one of the greatest men in the history of audio had just put him in his place. And everyone else at the table knew it. And that is absolutely one of my favorite Paul Klipsch stories.
We never said it at the beginning, but today is April 28th, 2017, and it's now about 4:20 in the afternoon. Yesterday we had the ceremony. I just want that on there in case somebody goes back 100 years from now and tries to figure out when we did this. But now we're going to talk about business climate. And one of the things, as you know, that in the forum, diehard Klipsch fans, heritage has a very significant meaning to them. I was looking through the dealer price sheets and older ones, and obviously in the 60s, 70s, up through the 90s, there was just the original 4 or 5 speakers, and they were for sale at the time. Then in about 1995, 96, the price sheet listed Heritage. It listed the other products, Chorus, whatever there might be, and then Line, Heritage, and then the big 5 were on there. But where did the Heritage line, the idea of Heritage, come from? Who did that?
I'm going to give you my best recollection on it, and with time, there are certain things that don't stand out as a big moment in time, and so your memory is not entirely clear. But what was happening at the time is the portfolio of products was growing, one of the concerns was that how do we signify certain elements of our product portfolio? And at the time, it was pretty easy to put Heritage into its own package of products, and it generally, as I recall, were with the La Scala bell, Klipsch horn, and Heresy. And I think it was just as simple as that. It was not at the time. We've got to put a box around stuff that only Paul was involved with. There was not conversations like that. It was sort of this natural feel that you had about these were the original products, and we're going to put those in the Heritage series. I think that what happens sometimes with decisions that are made or changes, that they can pick up a meaning of their own that may or may not have been the intention. And again, you have to remember the time frame of that in the 90s. We also, then later on, you have the reference series and you have different series of products. And it became more of a kind of a series of products is really what the thinking was behind it at the time. I didn't have a lot of involvement in it when it was going on. I believe that it was probably driven by the Klipsch's more the Fred and Judy side. Again, there was no bad intent behind doing it. It was just, we need to put some boundaries around some of this stuff to the best of our ability.
You were quoted in an article, an interview, quote, "In 1996, we were in trouble and needed to cross the valley of death in business terms by taking on the engineering and product development teams. In addition to sales and marketing, our current president of sales, Dave Kelly, and I decided we were going to take the lead and change the game. 1 year later, we reintroduced our entire product line and raised our margins by 9%. For many reasons, our design changed the path that Klipsch was on for the next 15 years." This goes back in the earlier segment. Mm-hmm. You talked about this melding engineering and sales. What was it that you specifically did? You were going to take the lead and change the game, reintroduced our entire product line. What was the product line that you reintroduced?
So earlier I had mentioned that when I started with the company that Klipsch was really behind the curve in how we handled our distribution. We'd really tried to stay loyal to how it had been, and yet distribution was changing radically. How people bought was changing radically. The kinds of retailers that were out there were changing radically. And everyone loved us, but if we didn't, sometimes you have to charge forward with an aggressive stance and really take charge of what you're going to do. And so in 96, we went out and we said, there's a couple of things that are critical for us if we're going to survive and thrive. Is one, we have to have some products that can survive on a larger scale, because there was a consolidation of specialty retailers. The one-off stores were still there, but lots of them now were turning into regional chains with 10, 12, 15, 20 stores, and even some of them were consolidating. And if we didn't find a way to have products that were on those floors, we risked becoming irrelevant. And no, it couldn't be the traditional products that we had built before, because those floors were selling products that were still high performance, but lesser cost. And so what we did in 96 is we actually brought all of our customers. We were at the Holiday Inn Crowne Plaza in Las Vegas. We brought our designer out, and we had introduced some additional concepts. But we brought every customer in, and we said, while you're here, we would like for you to critique these products and help us. And we made changes on the fly to products after we got really good consolidated feedback on what we were working on. And we were able to, and this is something that we learned at the time, it wasn't just the products. It was also, how are we going to take them to market? How are we going to package them? What kind of displays were we going to have in the stores? And so what happened through that process was that we really reinvented ourselves, and we really reinvented how we were going to go to market. So when we finally launched these new products, and I believe at the time they may have been the Synergy series, but I'm not positive I'm right on that topic, and unfortunately my memory is not that great. But those products were, I think there were about 6 or 7 products in the lineup, And it was the first time that we'd launched an entire series of products with all the marketing material, with the display material, with the promotional activities, with training activities, all at one time. And so it was sort of a rebirth for us, not just about product, but how products need to be sold on those kinds of floors in today's environment. And that's really what I was talking about. And it required that we couldn't be in a battle with the engineering and design teams. We're like, well, we don't want to do this because we want to build much more expensive wood cabinets or whatever it might be. It was, this is not about who's right or wrong in this. Those wonderful products that we build, we need to keep building them. But if we want to survive and thrive and be relevant, we have to build some things that are different. It included, as a matter of fact, our first plastic tool product, which was a small bookshelf speaker that also ended up being, it was a KG 1.1, as a matter of fact, was the model number. And that led to being our first outdoor waterproof speaker as well. And, so that's what I meant about, changing things up a little bit. As a matter of fact, with the KG1, one of the great stories about that product is it didn't do as well as we had hoped out of the gate. And so I approached Fred Klipsch with the idea that we do something nobody had done in our industry before. And I said, what I want a great picture of you, and I want to put that stack of 5 of those speakers and a subwoofer out, 5.1, and we're going to take that picture, and then we want to run an ad that says, the best sounding system under $1,000, I guarantee it, and you have a 30-day guarantee that you'll buy the products back and want your signature on it. And the reason we did it was not because we believed that somehow customers would go crazy over it, but we wanted to take it out to the dealers and say, you're not going to support putting this system on your floor when Fred Klipsch, the owner of the company, is going to do this ad. We went from selling $1,000 a month to $5,000 a month, and it never changed. Because once we got them on the floor, they were fantastic products and people loved them. But we just weren't seen as a company that did those things. And so we used whatever tactics we could to say, Fred's doing the ad, I'll let you call him and tell him you're not going to support him when he's doing this for the first time. And it was things like that. It changed everything. Our margins went up by 9 points and really gave us a healthy bottom line, which we needed. And people saw us differently after that. That was the first time that they said, you know what, they're building really cool stuff and there's this great history, but these guys are onto something else here.
The speaker that's behind your right shoulder there is the Jubilee that was taken out to CES by Paul Klipsch. It was the last speaker that he had personal involvement in it. Unfortunately, didn't end up being an official retail product. But can you tell us what your memory was? Were you at that CES when they brought that out, and Roy Delgado, who worked on it with him? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, it was. I think that Paul and Roy maybe worked on that for 2 or 3 years. It was a real labor of love, and I remember when we got to CES because it was one of the last times that Paul came to CES, and it was not quite a throne, but it was sort of almost like a throne. And I'll never forget Paul sitting in that and people lining up, lines of people waiting to get an autograph and get a picture with Paul Klipsch. And I thought it was kind of incredible. Now, the speaker itself was fantastic, and there's lots of lore and debate about why it didn't go into production. The only thing that I remember about that when it was going on is that if you take a look at it, you can see this horn that was carved out of wood. I remember there was a lot of debate about that. It was just the price was being driven completely astronomically. But if somebody were to say, you have to tell us why it didn't go into production, I honestly don't know. And as I said to the guys recently, if this product should be in production, let's put it in production. Because the thing that we found is, and if you were to look at our sales numbers, the sales of Heresies and Cornwalls and Klipsch horns and things, they're really, we're back on a much healthier growth pattern with these. There's such demand with the resurgence of 2-channel and vinyl. These products were made for that, and it doesn't hurt that mid-century modern design in almost everywhere is popular on a global basis, and it just so happens those products that Paul Klipsch designed, they happen to be perfect for it.
Last hour or so that we've been chatting, talked about all the great speakers, but they've all been consumer products. Klipsch has a pretty substantial professional market in there. Can you tell us about where professional was when you joined the company?
When I joined, I didn't have a tremendous amount of involvement, but I was able to observe what was happening. And cinema was certainly part of the business, but we were all over the board. When I started, we were chasing everything. We were still working at doing a lot of big fixed install systems. We were still doing some small tour sound, things like that. And the challenge was that it was one of those where, first off, romantically, there was just a real strong draw to it. From the consumer side, having our professional business be sort of the Formula One testing for what we take into consumer, all of those things were really positive, good things that we liked about it. There was a period of time that Fred licensed the brand to another company. And as happens with license deals, sometimes they don't go well, and that did not go well. It didn't start well. It didn't go well during it, and it didn't end particularly well. But we did end up with the brand back. And what we tried to do over the past 15 years is really focus on segments where we could make a difference, and that we thought that we had the time, energy, money, and reputation to be good at. So one was in professional cinema. We thought that fit our profile well, and we had a real strong ability to perform at a high level. And then we tried to focus more on the restaurant, retail, and background sound. A lot of people talk about houses of worship and tour sound and giant fixed install. Those are all things, but at some point when you're running a business, you have to say, if we don't bring some focus to what we're doing, we're going to end up doing nothing. And that's where it really lays right now, is we focus heavily on the cinema side. We focus on the restaurant, retail, background sound side. We do some other things. They're just not core to the business today. I can tell you that our wish would be, sitting here in 2017, that over the next 5 years, we would really like to see a large investment in developing the professional business. And we'd like to see that be one of our diversification strategies.
In terms of professional cinema, you're already fairly, you have a pretty good market share with that, and
yes.
What do you attribute that to?
We win the shootouts. So what happens if you think about the cinema business? For the consumers, one of the things that's important is it sounds great, and when you're trying to one up your competitor, they can sell popcorn, they can sell Twizzlers, they can sell sodas. So you're not one-upping them there, you're just doing the same thing. The movie content, they're probably not going to one-up you on the movie content. So then it comes down to the experience. How vivid is the picture? How good is the screen? How comfortable are the seats? What does it sound like? And then on the business side of it, what's the last thing that a cinema owner wants? He wants his speakers not working, because you lost one of the biggest parts of the experience. So when we go in, here's what we know confidently. We're more efficient, which means that we need less power. Now, if you're a cinema owner, that means two things. You have to spend less money on amplification. It also means that the reliability of the product is going to be better, because you're running a less electrical power into that speaker, which means the voice coil doesn't heat up as much, which means they don't break as often. So you don't have as much downtime. So we sound better. We're more reliable. By buying less electronics, the system actually costs less. And did I cover them all? So we sound better, we're more reliable, and we cost less. What else could there be if you're in a business like that? And that's how we ended up with 50% of the cinemas in the U.S. And by the way, in China, which is the fastest growing cinema market in the world, we're starting to rock in China as well. Same reasons. We keep going.
Yesterday, we had the transfer ceremony memorializing the transfer of this building we're in today, the Klipsch Museum of Audio History, from Klipsch Group Incorporated to the nonprofit organization, the Klipsch Heritage Museum Association, which is going to continue to operate the museum, which is been in operation since about 1980. Can you tell us a little bit why KGI, Klipsch, got behind getting this into a non-profit?
Well, first off, preserving this is, I've always said to everyone, when I look at my role in this, is that I was loaned this company for some period of time. And part of my responsibility is to be a good steward of not just the employees and the current business, but to protect the legacy. And the one thing that I knew with the loss of Jim Hunter when he was retiring is that we would have lost someone that has made this his life's work. So when Jim approached me on creating the Klipsch Heritage Museum Association, it hit all of my hot buttons, because first, Jim is going to be involved. And then our passionate forum members, many of which are going the pilgrimage every year, are going to be involved. And third, he can turn it into a not-for-profit organization. Jim's going to move back to Hope, Arkansas. And that part all resonated really well with me. The other side of it is without that, without Jim, without the association, without the members, to me there was risk in all of this. Because if you can imagine, so I preach being a good steward. What kind of good steward would I be if this building wasn't maintained, if the archives were not maintained, if we didn't make sure products that we have in storage other places were maintained? And one day you look at all of this and it's in disrepair. That's not a good steward. And when I looked at the two options, that's why for me it was easy to sit with John and Pat and say, here's an opportunity for us to do something really good. Because these people believe in this, and you have the guy that has spent his life trying to protect it, and they want to take this thing on. We have an opportunity to donate the archives and the facility and the land for them to create something that is a good thing. And for me personally, part of this gets into that concept of giving back. As you leave your legacy, you want to be known for something. I'd like to be known as one of the person at KGI that was able to help facilitate creating just pretty incredible association and membership, and I think protecting the Paul Klipsch legacy forever. And then it becomes part of my legacy as well as Pat and John Shallum, because they both were behind this. And that's the reason that I wanted to be on the board itself and be part of it, is that I think I have a responsibility to continue giving back and continue supporting the protection of Paul's legacy.
And I was going to ask you, you are one of the 9 trustees. You were given the original invitation along with the other 8, and you immediately responded yes, and you're an active trustee. You make time to attend the meetings. Is there anything else you wanted to say about why you decided to be an active, involved trustee?
Well, it's part of giving back and paying it forward. I mean, honestly, it's not a lot more than that. And sometimes you can go out and look for, I'm going to work for a charity, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. Well, why not start at home? This is about the industry that it's been my career and a lot of other people. And so it's part of this is about people's careers, it's their passion. And if I can play some small role in making sure that the Paul Klipsch's life's work, which is why I'm here right now, can be protected, then why not use that as one of the things that I give back to? And that's really what it's about.
Yesterday during your keynote address, you talked about Jim Hunter as a man, Jim Hunter as a Klipsch employee and historian, and Jim Hunter as the first curator of the museum. I received several unsolicited comments today about your sincerity and emotion about talking about Jim. We captured all of that on video yesterday, I believe. I just wondered if don't need you to repeat everything. Is there anything else you wanted to add about that?
Honestly, being able to say that about Jim was really my driving force in being here. And as you know, it was 24 hours of travel without sleep, to be here. But I've known Jim for 26 years, and Jim is a really, truly kind guy. And over that 26 years, with all the change and things that I had seen happen, there were two things that always stood out about Jim. Is that even at times where I felt in the whole of what was going on, Jim wasn't given the respect that I felt that he had earned and deserved. And at times, I saw Jim not even being treated particularly well by not by Paul, but there were different ownership and things that happened. And I was always highly sensitive to that, because when I was young, Jim was definitely a mentor. I watched how Jim operated. I watched how he behaved with his employees and team. But the other part is that through any of that, it never derailed him from protecting Paul's legacy. And I always admired that, because a lot of people might have gotten mad and they might have kicked up dust and they might have said, you know what, it's just not worth it. And Jim never did it. And to me, it was a reflection of, as I talked about some of the things I learned from Paul, it was obviously that Jim had those as well, is you take the stuff as it comes, but it doesn't derail you from if you're living your values, if you're living your core, if you get the courage to stand up. Some of the times that I saw Jim be kind of beat around a bit, he was standing up for what he believed, and people couldn't accept that. They didn't agree with it, so they couldn't accept it. But Jim would stand up for it. Jim is someone that in the entirety of time that I've known him, I never saw him stretch the truth. I never saw him do anything that could have saved him a heartache, because that was the level of integrity he had. And I said in the meeting I would trust Jim with my life, and I meant that. And I also think he's one of the most honorable men that I've ever known. And so when I think about him being the curator and the guardian of this thing, and is the first one, there isn't anyone. In fact, I don't know who could ever replace Jim, because he's a one-of-a-kind individual. And he deserved that kind of recognition yesterday in front of his wife and other peers. And I could say it because I spent 26 years watching it. So I'm an expert in all things Jim Hunter, and what I said was true, and it is what kind of person he is, and we could not have anyone better to lead this.
I agree. Well, that's all I had for you today. Did you want to make any last-minute comments or anything? Floor is yours. Did we cover everything you wanted to cover?
You know what? We could talk for hours about all this stuff. It is my life, and my son is now in the business, and it's become his life. And we have a lot of people in the organization that I've got 26 years in it. And honestly, I have no idea where 26 years have gone, because every day has been about creating great sound, changing people's lives, and trying to be really smart about what we do in the future. Because as I've said to everyone, my job as CEO, this company was given to me on loan, and my job is to make sure that we build a scalable, sustainable company that's around for another 70 years. And we never allow the flame to go out on what Paul Klipsch started.
It says a lot about having your own son in the company and what you think about the company. Tommy is what position?
Vice President of North American Sales.
So do you think we'll have one or other of your young daughters working in the company in 25 years?
I think that I have certainly one of those two that's 2.5 that she'll either be the president of this or the president of the United States. I'm not sure which, but she's going to run something. I'm positive of that.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.